My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Kelsey Glasser. It's July 18th, 2024, and we're at Arden Restaurant in Portland. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
First question to get things started is why wine?
Why wine, honestly, is because I fell in love. I was working in restaurants. Because I was acting. Those two often go very closely together. I had been in New York and I went to LA, and I got lucky my first job was for Jose Andres, so I was working in a pretty competitive and a restaurant environment with a pretty high bar for food and wine. So I started to learn about it and really enjoyed it. And then I went to another restaurant, and the wine director was a guy named Alex, and we really hit it off and became more than just friends. And wine is like his life. And so, I had known about wine and started to learn about it when I was working for Jose, but it wasn't until I met Alex that I was like, oh, this is a way for me to connect with him, and this is like this language that he speaks. And that was sort of my pathway into it. And shortly after, I became a sommelier, and within a pretty quick period of time, started running a different wine program in Los Angeles at a real crazy spot called EPLP. And then he and I started talking about wanting to, and really I was kind of following his lead. Like, he wanted us to have our own wine shop, wine bar, and we were looking in Los Angeles, and it was just cost prohibitive. We couldn't get a liquor license. And I was from here. I'm born and raised here, but I'd been gone for about a decade. And I had just come up for a friend's wedding. This was in late 2015. And I came back to LA just on fire with excitement about Portland and how the food and wine scene was just exploding. And I actually grew up out in the Valley, which is not to totally derail us, but as I was doing all my, somm classes, I would hear about the Willamette Valley, and I'm like, that Willamette Valley, like the one that I grew up in? Like, I never thought of it as wine country. But especially in those 10 years I had been gone, it was really starting to blossom. And I was just really impressed with how much was happening. And so within a couple months, we found this space that was a block over and a block down. It was a live-work space. It was like a split loft space in the Honeyman Hardware lofts. And we could do it without investors, and we could get a liquor license. And so we quit our jobs and we moved up here, and we actually lived upstairs in the loft and spent about 6 months working just in the industry here. Alex repped wine for a couple local winemakers, and I got a job waiting tables at Paley's Place. And we put all of our money into building inventory at Thelonious. It was called Thelonious Wines. And as soon as we opened the doors in June 2016, and by September it was making enough money that we could move out. And we moved up in the Alphabet District and turned the upstairs into a seating loft. Mm-hmm. And it just became this kind of neighborhood haunt. People really loved it, and I think responded to how simple, and I mean, to be totally honest, I don't know if we're gonna, I'll say this, I don't think I can get in trouble now. I don't think the health department ever knew we existed. We didn't have a commercial kitchen. We were just serving cheese and charcuterie. We of course had a wine license, but it was not set up for big commercial operations. The bathroom was upstairs. It was not handicap accessible. We had a cat. My cat lived there before we moved out. And so people would come in and have a glass of wine, and Thea was running around, and I think people just really responded to that. And it became kind of a neighborhood favorite. And that was my first real experience being a business owner. I had managed restaurants and of course managed wine programs, but it was definitely this learning curve of all the paperwork, all the logistical stuff, all the non-wine stuff. And after 2 years, we realized we really wanted to be able to serve food, legal fashion. And this space, the Arden space, became available. It had been a restaurant previously, it had been closed, and it was right next door. And we were like, oh, it already has a kitchen. We could just move over here. We posted a listing for a chef. We envisioned it as just a wine bar with some good food. Mm-hmm. But we got a resume from a gal in San Francisco who had had Michelin stars at her last 2 restaurants, Sarah Hamann, and she really wanted to move up here. And so suddenly we were like, oh, damn, like this is going to be a real restaurant, you know? And we got a lot of press, and we opened sort of with a good amount of fanfare. So suddenly we had both places. And it was a tough first year. And it was really tough because Alex and I were like trying to make a relationship work and also running 2 businesses. And suddenly we had the dynamics of, you know, a chef and a whole team of other people. And long story short, we split the businesses. And so Alex kept Thelonious and I kept Arden. And sadly, he closed Thelonious during the pandemic and moved back to, he floats all around and consults now, and we're still dear friends. But Thelonious is no more. Arden still stands. I've had it now for 6.5 years. Our second anniversary was like the week of the shutdown. And we had a chef change 1 year in. Sarah is super talented chef, but I think she would say this too. She did say this too, like working in restaurants was never what she wanted. She has this awesome tinned fish company now, Tiny Fish. She was on Top Chef. But we got really lucky and picked up Eric Van Clay like 1 year in. And he's been here ever since. He's now a co-owner with me. We're so blessed to have him. So yeah, that's why wine.
The whole story.
The whole story.
Okay, I want to back up a little bit. I have a lot of things to follow up on. Let's start with the first career. Tell us about getting into acting.
Yeah. Well, I guess my therapist would say that I started to love acting when I was really little because I was homeschooled. My parents were kind of hippies, and they never wanted us to associate learning with boredom. And so I was homeschooled like through elementary school, and as a result, I think I always kind of craved social connection, and just didn't get that like social conditioning, I suppose. and I think part of that was like manifested as becoming like, you know, a performer, you know, and an overachiever. And I always I still want to do everything really well. And so when I was like 7 or 8, I wanted to do all the activities. And I played soccer and basketball and piano lessons and dance. And one of those things, I was like, I want to do theater classes. And as I got older, all the other activities kind of like fell away. Because if you want to get good at something, you have to like devote more and more time to it. And so I started acting when I was like 8. And I think it became this like really validating and wonderful social outlet for me. And I actually, where I did all this acting was just up the street here at Northwest Children's Theater on 18th and Everett. I spent a good amount of my formative years there and started doing all their classes. And by the time I was in high school, I was doing their like main stage shows, which was awesome for me because you get to miss all this school because it's like professional theater, and we would do school performances, and I was like working with adult professional actors. And so by the time I was like a freshman in high school, I was like, I want to go to college for acting. Like, you know, that was my thing for most of my life. And, you know, my parents, they say like their favorite day was the day I finally got my learner's permit because they were so sick of making the 45-minute commute from Chehalem Mountain to Northwest Children's Theater. And I, you know, like I said, I'm an overachiever, and I set my sights on NYU, and I auditioned their early decision, and I got in, and I went to NYU to their acting program, to Tisch, in the Atlantic Theater Company, and I graduated a little bit early, and so I was in New York for about 4 years, but my eventual goal was always like get to Los Angeles. My aunt, who passed away like 8 years ago, but she was a movie producer, and so I think that was some of the drive for me. You know, that's where I first saw acting and saw movies, and I grew up getting to visit her on film sets, and always saw her reading scripts, and I spent a couple summers there with her as like a high school student. So it was always like, get to LA and become a movie star. And, I have a lot of compassion for the 22-year-old version of me who just didn't have like the self-confidence and the emotional coping skills to deal with all that rejection. And, LA is a tough city. Like, there's a lot of beautiful things about it. But it was tough for me at 22. And inevitably what you do when you get to LA as an actor is you get a job in a restaurant. And I got lucky and I got this job for Jose Andres at the Bazaar. And at the time I was like cocktailing, and I kind of worked my way up to serving and eventually bartended, did a bunch of stuff. But while that was happening, where I was kind of seeing forward momentum in this great restaurant with these people that I really loved, and it was like I would learn things and I would see them pay off, and I would get promoted, and I would like see a direct payoff for my effort. Meanwhile, in the acting world, I felt like I was getting more and more discouraged and jaded and frustrated and insecure. And eventually I just stopped auditioning more and more. And it was a really like bittersweet choice for me when I decided to become a sommelier, because it felt, I think at the time, and now I've definitely reframed it, but at the time it felt like, oh, if I'm going into this wine world, I just have to shut the door on the acting world. Like, no one's going to take me seriously in the wine world if I'm just like some girl who's, one in a million actresses in LA. And so I did do that. I just kind of said, okay, maybe this chapter of my life is done. And I jumped like fully into wine. But it was like sad for me. And I guess I should also say, I don't know if this is relevant to our conversation, but NYU was a really, really high pressure environment. And in Portland, I was always like the big fish in the little pond. And then I moved to get plopped into Manhattan from like a 5-acre farm. There's no campus there. It's just like the city. And suddenly my peers are like Kiefer Sutherland's daughter and Haley Joel Osment and the girl who played Matilda, and like very wealthy kids, and suddenly, and it really, I felt insecure, and the point is, by the time I graduated, I had like debilitating stage fright. Like, to the point where I tried to do a couple plays in New York, and I was like having panic attacks. And in my head, I was like, oh, in LA, I can do TV and film and it won't be as scary. But I got there and I was still like, I wasn't doing a good job. I didn't feel good. I felt like very self-conscious, very fearful. So I just wasn't equipped. I like needed to do some self-work. And so it was like when I switched into wine, it was kind of a relief almost, because I had so much fear suddenly wrapped around acting, but also very sad. And so it wasn't until, I worked in wine for a couple years in LA. We came up here, we had Thelonious, we opened Arden. And it was like 2 years after we opened Arden, finally, it's like right before the pandemic. This was like fall of 2019. I finally felt like I kind of knew what we were doing here, And when Alex and I split the businesses, I was like, oh, shoot, like I have a whole restaurant to run, and I never took a business class in my life. And I like hired a business coach, hired a new therapist, and just like, it was a lot of good work. And so about a year after that, I kind of felt like things were settled here. And I was like, God, I miss acting so much. And I like missed it just from how much joy it used to bring me. Like, I didn't need to make money from it. Didn't need to be famous. There's like, neither of those are options in Portland, But I just missed it. I missed theater. And I like reached out to an old mentor here, and he was like, why don't you come just take my scene study class, just dip your toe back in. And it was like a scary process, but it was very healing. And he encouraged me to just do one audition, like Portland does citywide auditions. And I did it that year, and I got one call back for one show, which was Shakespeare in Love. And I'm a Shakespeare nerd. I named my restaurant after a forest in As You Like It. It's always been me. And I booked the lead in Shakespeare in Love. And it was like, the show closed a month before shutdown. And it was this the whole play is about like the healing and transformative power of theater, you know? And it just felt like this like, beautiful gift from the universe. And it also showed me like I can have both. And so that was really wonderful and kind of, I don't know if it fueled me to help get us through the pandemic, but it definitely put me in like wonderful spirits. And then the world shut down and I was like, that's okay, we'll figure it out. So yeah, and so now where things are, I give myself the gift of doing one play a year because it's a big time commitment. And you know, it's like 3 months of your life. It's like 6 weeks of rehearsal, 6 weeks of performances generally. And I'm really grateful that Arden is in a place where like I can take that time off. And like I shot a feature film last year, which was super cool. And so I just try to like, if things present themselves, I really try to embrace it and be grateful for it and not look at it as needing to get a paycheck. Because I feel like when you take any creative pursuit and try to monetize it, it like ruins the joy of it, which is for sure what happened to me in LA. So yes.
While you were in LA, was there a highlight for you? Was there something that you're proud of your work from there?
I would say it was a lot of like short films and commercials. I did an ongoing web series that was like, there was a point where like web series were like a big thing. And it was really fun. And it was called Couch Surfers. And when that was like a concept. And so it was like a guy who decided he didn't want to pay rent. He would just couch surf. And so every episode was like a different crazy host he stayed with, which was a funny concept. And I was his like responsible friend who he had a crush on, who was always just like along for the adventure. But we got some pretty big comedians involved as like the guest hosts, like Mary Beth Monroe did a couple episodes. It's been so long that I'm like forgetting who all these comedians were, but it was just fun. And we did it for 2 seasons. And then there was like, I wrote a couple short films, which was and produced, which was my first foray into that. And I actually, well, I don't know if I should mention this, but I really enjoy the writing process, and I'm such a like go-getter that I'm a good producer. You know, it's just you get shit done. And I acted in those as well. And my dream has always been to produce a full feature film. And I actually, literally this summer, finally finished work on like a screenplay I've been working on for the last 3 years that is Twelfth Night, my favorite Shakespeare play, set in Oregon wine country, like modern day.
Nice.
And it's sort of like a love letter to both of my favorite things. And I would, saying this out loud, sending it out into the universe, I would like love to get that shot in the next year or so. Because I just think like, you know, we need more wine movies. Why not?
Congratulations on completing that. That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah.
All right. So the wine part, you
Yes.
mentioned kind of shutting one door, opening another
Yeah.
door. Tell me about the decision to do sommelier rather than production or anything else. Why did you choose that path? And tell me about sort of the steps along the way.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was working in restaurants, and by the time I became a somm when I was 25, and I'd been working in restaurants since I was like 18. So I was very familiar with that world, the restaurant world. So it never really occurred to me like, oh, I should go make wine. I was already selling wine. And again, like Alex he was the wine director of the restaurant where I met him. And so that was just the career path that I like saw through his eyes sort of. And when I was working at the Bazaar, again, it was Jose Andres. It was a very high profile restaurant, and it was molecular gastronomy, and there was like weeks of training involved, especially for the food. You know, you had to know that the spherified olives were like sodium alginate and all the crazy stuff. And wine was a part of that. And it was all Spanish wine, mostly Spanish wine. And so that was kind of my first, like I remember like falling in love with an Albarino and being like, oh my God. Like before that I had drank Sauvignon Blanc and Sancerre, which I feel like is a lot of people's gateway wine. But suddenly kind of shifting into learning about Spanish wine was really fun for me. And it was the first time that I realized there was a lot of storytelling involved in wine and history. Like, I was almost a history minor. I love history. And, you know, those things are very parallel with acting, you know, storytelling and history and kind of weaving this like world for people to be invited into. And so kind of, and when I moved from the Bazaar to this other restaurant, the Evely, it was a big focus on California wine. And I always reference this, but there was a winemaker named Sean Thackeray who passed away last year, I think, year before last, who has like a very special place in my heart because his wines and him were like this beautiful story. Like, he was an art dealer in San Francisco who read ancient Greek and Latin, and he collected ancient books. Like, that's what he dealt in. And he got a hold of these ancient Grecian or Roman winemaking manuscripts and fell in love with it and like bought a farm in Bolinas and went off the grid and taught himself to make wine from these ancient texts. And like, so he was doing kind of off the wall, non-traditional techniques. You know, he would like open ferment everything under these eucalyptus trees and all the leaves would fall in and the wines always had a note of eucalyptus, and he exposed them to a lot of oxygen. Like, he didn't do very anaerobic environments. And he named them all after the constellations, and he had a fox that like befriended him named Belle. And I would tell that story and people would buy the wine and they loved the wine. And it was this very, and then he was one of the first winemakers who I had been selling his wines, and I got to go visit and like meet the person and see the place and like barrel taste. And I just think that was like that was kind of the moment where I was like, oh, like, I see the whole process from start to finish. There's this amazing human doing this crazy, cool, creative thing. And then somehow it gets to me in the restaurant. And if I can like do him justice and like tell that story, then it becomes this really special experience for the person drinking it. Like, they're going to enjoy it more when they have this context. Like, they're still going to like the wine if they're just blind tasted on it. But the story and that makes the experience more special. And as that was also happening, like, Alex was the one leading that wine program. And people were just excited about wine at that restaurant. And he was just like, you're good at this. You could become a somm. And being an overachiever, I did it all very quickly. Like, I really crammed and studied for, within 6 months, I had already gotten my certified, like the first 2 levels of the court. And I actually am only just now going back and doing my advanced because I switched paths and did WSET 3 and half of diploma during the pandemic. And at the time, they didn't offer it in Portland. And so I was having to do it all online and then fly to San Francisco. And at a certain point, I just kind of burned out on it and I was frustrated with the online system. So I may finish diploma too. But anyway, rambling. I became a somm and then got my first, basically I got hired as not the wine director, but just the sommelier at this new restaurant that was opening. It was like a 3-floor madhouse right in West Hollywood, owned by these crazy Australians. It was like very sceney. But the chef was this very talented, serious chef from Fiji. And so it was like a restaurant on the 2nd floor and then a rooftop. And so I came on just as the somm, but within a month of opening, the wine director, who was also the general manager, kind of had a meltdown and basically got fired. And I should not have been given that job by all rights because I had very little experience, but the owners, God love them, didn't know any better. And they were like, do you want to be the wine director? I was like, yes. And so I had a real steep learning curve. So like in the same calendar year as like getting all my somm credentials, I was suddenly running this like very, very high profile wine program. And, we were moving so much volume. Like, I was ordering 10 cases of rosé a week just for the rooftop. And because it was LA, you would get massive discounts on volume. So I learned a lot about like negotiating pricing and strategy there. And it was a big challenge for me because I was basically running 2 wine programs. Like on the restaurant level, I really got to do more serious wines and have like a more eclectic global selection. And it was pairing with like Southeast Asian food, which is not the easiest wine to pair to. So it was a lot of like high acid aromatic whites, and then kind of like lighter, lower tannin, like more floral reds, a lot of Cab Franc, a lot of Gamay. And then on the rooftop, it was like people wanted Cab, they wanted Sauvignon Blanc, they wanted Chardonnay. It was like patio, a lot of rosé. It was like more identifiable wines. So it was really the best way to like figure out what I was doing. So it was like 2 different separate wine programs at once. And I did that until I moved up here.
To what you learned about building a wine program, obviously you mentioned kind of building 2 at the same time. What are the key tenets for you when it comes to building a wine program?
Yeah, I think you really have to take into context your restaurant and your audience. Obviously, it sounds obvious, but I think the instinct when you take over a program is to want to put your mark on it. And I think you need to really put your own ego aside and your own. Of course, you use your palate and you trust your palate to discern what are good examples of the style that I'm looking for, but you kind of have to put your own wine style preferences aside, because otherwise a wine list that I'm building would be like all Chenin Blanc and Riesling and Jura, and it wouldn't have a lot of like Napa Cab on it, just because that's what I don't drink that as much. And I think like, I've actually never run a wine program at a steakhouse, and that would probably be a challenge for me because, when I just went and did the advanced course, and it was really, I flew to Dallas, and it's 3 days where you're just tasting like 50 wines a day, and it was a really good lesson for me because I was like, oh, I'm very strong in blind tasting for the wines that I drink a lot of, but full-bodied, high alcohol red wines with a lot of oak, Australia, Napa, South Africa, I was like not as good in those. And I would see that with a lot of other people there doing the course. Like some people were really strong in those areas, but couldn't guess a Muscadet for the life of them. And I was like, one sniff, Muscat, And so I think when you're building a wine list, you number one need to look at like what is the restaurant serving and what is the ideal wines for that cuisine. So like at EPLP, it was a lot of spicy food. It was curries. It was Szechuan pepper. It was, seafood. It was like light, aromatic, spicy. So the perfect wines for that food, like I said, is like high acid aromatic whites and like light floral reds with not a whole lot of tannin. But then so you have to have those on the list. But then you have to say, what's my audience? And my audience was Los Angeles, was California. And people drink Cabernet and like oaky Chardonnay. And I have a lot of respect for California wine, and it's evolving a lot. But like at the time, a decade ago, that's what people wanted. So then you have to make sure that there's those options on the list. And then for me, like then you fill in the gaps. Then you're like, well, someone might want a fuller bodied white, but not Chardonnay. So like, let's put some Viognier on there because that's going to still go well with the food, but is going to suit someone who doesn't like all that acid. So you kind of have like the restaurant and the clientele, and then you kind of fill in, and I think the filling in is where you can put your personal touch on it. Mm-hmm. Like at Arden, Eric's food does tend to be like lighter. He cooks with a lot of flavor. Chardonnay, Chenin Blanc are some of the best like through lines. Pinot Noir works well, like lighter. Gamay works really well throughout the meal. We don't have a ton of fuller bodied reds, but we have them on there, for those who want them. But then we also, like, we're in the Pearl District. We kind of tend to have not an older clientele, but like maybe a more traditional clientele. We're not on the east side. We can't have a ton of funky natural wines. So we make sure we have more traditional stuff for our community. We make sure we have stuff that's really suited to our cuisine. And then, like, I'm actually not the one who's the predominant wine buyer anymore. A couple years ago, I handed off, the official wine director title to Wesley, which was a big step for me, And I love it now because I can kind of be in the mentor position, the education position for the team, but I'm not the one having to, like, make sure we're not out of buy the glass stuff. And Wesley's really into Greek wine right now. He just went to Greece. So we have all this fun Greek wine where he can kind of like put the stuff he's excited about on there. And so, yeah, I just think it's serving the menu, serving your community, and then filling in what you're excited about.
So you mentioned coming up to Oregon and kind of getting the buzz, the Portland buzz. So tell me about, I guess at that point in your life, at that point in your career, what was your goal? Was there something you were striving for? Was there a plan in place or something you really wanted to do?
To be totally honest, the move up to Portland happened really fast, and it was also, my aunt was dying at the time, she was like my best friend. I won't get emotional, but it was a hard year, and there was a lot happening, and I don't know that I was thinking too far ahead, and we moved, and I think subconsciously, part of me was like, needed to get out of LA because I didn't want to be there without her there. And we moved up here in January, and the big focus, like kind of what I threw all my energy in, was just like getting the shop open. And she passed away in June, and so I was flying back down there a lot. And so I think part of me was just kind of in like survival mode, like figure out this shop. And and I think the big thing was like, that gave me a lot to focus on. It was like, figure out how to run a business, figure out how to run this shop. And it wasn't until like a year or so later, as I was kind of like unpacking all this and realizing, okay, we have like a functioning wine shop. And Alex and I are both big like dreamers. And so, yeah, we started talking about like, well, what if we had a restaurant too? And I was looking at what was happening in the Portland restaurant scene at the time, and there were a couple predominant like hospitality groups. There was John Gorham's group, there was Chef's Table, there was Submarine was really coming up. And so I started thinking, oh, well, that's what you do when you open a wine bar, and then you open a restaurant, you end up with a hospitality group, and you have, the Paleys, like who I'd just worked for. So I started to think that's what I wanted. And so I was kind of operating under that, because I thought, oh, it'll get easier and more profitable the more restaurants you have. I've now been disavowed of that illusion. But I actually did open a second restaurant during the pandemic in 2021. I had always had this dream because I'm very passionate about health and nutrition. And I saw in Los Angeles and in New York, there was this whole craze of plant-based fast casual, essentially. And it's funny because, have you heard of Erewhon? You've probably heard of Erewhon, maybe not. There's like a very bougie grocery store in Los Angeles called Erewhon. And it started as like this crunchy hippie granola store that I used to always go to. And now it has become like an Instagram meme that people make fun of Erewhon because it's so expensive. You're like $50 for bee pollen but they had this incredible salad bar where it was like, it wasn't just raw cauliflower. It would be like turmeric roasted cauliflower and, sesame, ginger, broccoli. And I moved up here and I was like, there is nothing like that up here. And I started thinking like, it would be so cool to open a plant-based fast casual place. And that's what I did. And I had it for 2 years. I actually opened it last summer. It was on Alberta and 15th. It was called Wild Thing. And it was like my little baby passion project. And I do not regret a day of it, but it was a big learning experience for me. It was like, I guess firstly, it was like I felt so close to it. I felt like it was my idea that I thought was such a good one. And it like hurt my feelings that it didn't take off the way I wanted it to. And I was kind of faced with like, and I don't want to go into all the reasons that I don't think it didn't work. But it ultimately didn't work. Like, it just wasn't making money. And so it was a tough decision to close it. But by the time we did, I was so exhausted because I was working 2 full-time jobs. Like, I would get up, go to the gym, go straight to Wild Thing, be at Wild Thing all day, and then come here and work service. And after 2 years of that, it was just, I couldn't do it. And especially because, like, Wild Thing would lose money and Arden would make money. And I was like, this is just crazy. And it really taught me, like, I don't want more than one restaurant. Because someone calls out, someone quits, something breaks, someone breaks in. You know, all of this stuff, you're the one getting the calls for it. And I recognize that, like, there's certainly a tipping point. Like, maybe if you have 5 restaurants, then you can have an operations manager and a, you know, the CMO, the CEO, all that stuff. But at the time, I was also, like, rediscovering how much I loved acting. And I was like, I have something that's, like, working really well right here, you know? And the more restaurants you add in, that is, like, the less time I have in my day. And so I'm so glad I opened it and learned that lesson. Because suddenly I was like, the last thing in the world that I want is a hospitality group. And I should say, simultaneously, during the pandemic, the gift of the pandemic for me was that we had to get very creative to stay alive. And, you know, we started putting food in boxes, which we do not normally do. And I started a virtual wine club. And every weekend for 2 full years, so it was like 110 wine tastings, I live streamed a wine tasting for an hour on Instagram. And I started selling, like, the first 1 or 2 was just like, oh, grab a bottle of wine and drink it with me. But then I was like, oh no, we could do a wine club. And so people would buy a case of wine, there was 8 bottles of wine, and we would taste 2 bottles every week. But I was doing, like, these lesson plans. Like, I would study all week. You know, I would spend like 6 to 10 hours a week prepping for these. And it really, like, I had never done wine education before. And A, I realized I really enjoyed it. And B, I was like, I think I'm pretty good at it because of all my acting stuff. You know, like, I can communicate to people. And I started thinking, like, oh, wow, this could be like an avenue for me. Because of course I love working in the restaurant, but anyone who's worked service in a restaurant, you're like, I can't do this forever. And I like to be in kind of like the bigger picture role here now at Arden, where I can focus more on, like, being the voice of the restaurant, like getting that out in the community, whether it's the newsletter, whether it's networking, whether it's coordinating events. And then of course, yes, managing finances, being the touch point for the management here, but I'm trying not to be here as much during service. And I really started thinking, like, I could and should make this wine education thing more of something. And so I started working on the idea of and the other big takeaway from that was, like, wow, there's really a market of people, non-industry people, who love wine but don't understand much about it and who feel very intimidated by it, and who find the general wine conversation to feel pretentious and alienating and confusing and expensive. And I just saw people respond so well to, and I wasn't teaching any material that someone couldn't find out by doing Google research or going to take a WSET class, but the kind of, like, hang up I realized is that nearly all wine education that exists is for wine professionals. Mm-hmm. It's not for the wine drinker. And I'm like, that inherently keeps the wine drinker in the dark and feeling like they don't know how to define their own palate. They don't know how to trust their own palate. They don't know what an aligoté is and why it's, you know what I mean? Like, and so I was like, I would love to design a wine course for non-wine professionals. And I did. So I created this fully digital wine course called 7-Day Sommelier. And I spent about a year writing it and working on it. And then I shot it last summer and released it last fall. And I'm really proud of it. And to be honest, I still have not quite figured out how to market it. And I think I have been having people take it. But I'm trying to figure out a way to tie in like a community aspect to it, because there's beauty in online courses, you can just like do it in your own time. But I also think like I want there to be more of like, whether it's a forum, whether it's, regular live Zoom calls. So I'm trying to figure out how to do that. But I have now created this whole other branch for myself called Raise a Glass Wine. I also, during the pandemic, my like pie in the sky goal would be to have like a wine travel show, a la Anthony Bourdain, but very different, where each episode is going to a different wine region, and you talk about why wine started there, what grapes are being grown. You meet winemakers, you meet farmers, you meet chefs, you taste the food with the wine, you see the landscape. And I shot a pilot for that during the pandemic in the Willamette Valley. And I would love to kind of like return to that at some point. So in my mind, I'm trying to now kind of like build this, and it's sort of uncharted because I'm not following anyone's example with it, but wine education from like for the normal person, from like an entertainment standpoint, I guess. Yeah.
You are an overachiever.
I know. I hear myself talk. I'm like, oh God. But yeah, trying to be better about it.
Let me back up for a second to Thelonious.
Yes.
So I'm curious about, obviously that's a whole new dive, as you mentioned, coming into Portland and opening your own thing. Tell me about, I guess, the vibe. What were you trying to create with it, and what did you create with it?
It was like going to your friend's house. It was very cozy, and it was such a labor of love. The downstairs was like smaller than this dining room. We like built it out from like going thrifting and finding cool stuff to put on the walls. And my dad, God bless him, like built all our wine racks. And Alex, to be fair, like has a better design eye than I do. He actually designed Arden. At a certain point, like he was kind of like coming up with a lot of the big ideas, and then I would figure out how to make them happen. And I'm like, I took a lot from that, because now I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that myself too. But like the bathroom was like collaged from magazines, and I think people walked in and it just felt warm and cozy and inviting. And again, like opposite what a lot of people associate with the wine world. It wasn't this big, grand, sterile tasting room. It was very inviting and very casual. But we had an awesome selection. And like, it was so small that I remember when we were figuring out the selection, we were new to Portland, and we figured out these are all the SKUs we want. We want one Sancerre. We want 2 Loire Valley Chenins at these different styles. We want 1 Washington cab. We want 2 Napa. We like lined up all the SKUs, and then we sent that out to the distributors, and we tasted everything blind, which was really cool, because we were so new to town that like we didn't know necessarily what was available here versus California. And so I still love that as a way to like create a wine list. And so we ended up with a selection that we felt great about, because we're like, we only have room for 1 Sancerre. We want it to be the best Sancerre. So at Thelonious, it was small and eclectic. And at first we were like, let's just get the retail section going. But we had this little counter. It was literally like a live workspace. So there was like a little residential kitchen with like a bar top. And we built it out. We like asked for free wooden wine crates and ripped them apart and like decorated those everywhere. We made this cool bar out of it. And so we just started pouring wines, and we had the Coravan tank system, and we would have like 25 wines Coravan at any given time. And we could be very fluid with what we wanted to serve and pour, because it was just me and Alex. It was like, you didn't have to do staff training. You didn't have to run it through. Like, we were the chefs, and we were everything. And so if we were like, let's do and we would do events, and Alex can cook and I can't, and he's Argentine. And so, he'd be like, let's have a grill, let's do asado today. And he would like put a grill in front of the restaurant, probably totally illegal. And we would be like, let's do choripan. And we would like blast it out on social media, and we would pour fun wine. And I think like because people could see that we were just kind of doing whatever we wanted, we just got all these regulars. And we would open like really cool stuff. Like we would have total library stuff on Corvan that you could pay $20 for like a half glass and try, Sasakaya. It was cool stuff like that. And it changed up so much that I think people didn't get bored coming in. And it's like the bigger you get, we change our By the Glass program a lot and our wine list a lot, but there's a certain point where like you can't change it too much or the staff can't keep up. But because it was just us two, it was like we could do whatever we wanted. And there was a lot of beauty to that. I learned that like I prefer to work in a more collaborative environment, from the sense that like, if you were there all day, you were kind of just there all day. And sometimes there might be stuff going on, but sometimes I was bored. Or sometimes, God bless them, you would get like one person come in and you would be their therapist for, it's like a bartender, but it's just you and them. And there were certain people that realized they could come in at like 2 p.m. and just have your captive attention for 4 hours. So, but it was a small enough scale that it was a great way to learn the business of, and I had never worked in a retail environment. And to be honest, I don't know how people keep just retail wine operations alive. Like all our money came from By the Glass sales. The wine markup on retail is very small. And as we had it for a while, and as we were trying to start Arden, we would try intermittently to like hire an employee over there. And the bummer thing was that like it made money for whoever was working there. So if it was when it was just the two of us, like we made fine money. But then you add an employee in and suddenly the employee's making money, but you're not. It wasn't super scalable. It was such a small scale. And so it was beautiful while it existed, but it wasn't like a long-term profitable endeavor, I suppose. And I think with retail, I think the strongest retail presence is in Portland, like have a robust online sales program. And I think that's kind of needed if you want to have a retail shop survive. And we toyed with getting shipping licenses, like especially when I was doing the wine club here during the pandemic. And if I never have to ship another bottle of wine, it'll be too soon. Like, it was a nightmare. It's like so complicated. And I can do that paperwork, but I do not enjoy it. Like, I'm good at this. And I don't want to be like head down in a spreadsheet all the time. So, yeah, lots of lessons and a lot of fun from that place. And it was really like, it was how we met all these amazing winemakers. It was how we entered the wine community, and we also just started, like, we were out in wine country, we could set the hours, and probably a couple times we were too, like, liberal with, like, oh, it's going to be a slow day, let's just close and go out to wine country. But we could do that. And so we were doing a lot of visiting out there, meeting people, and then saying, hey, Mike Etzel, like, do you want to, can we, like, found some old magnums, like, we would love to crack them open, like, could we do a Beaufrere event? And surprisingly, like, you ask these people that seem like high profile people and they're usually down. And so we made relationships with like the top winemakers in Oregon and really just had our finger on the pulse of like new winemakers coming up, the kind of like OG people. And so by the time we started Arden, we were in a really good place to, like, know who to talk to and what wines to bring in.
So tell me about Arden. Obviously, you mentioned this is not what you initially intended,
Yeah.
the kind of the fine restaurant. So tell me about getting it started and about as the ethos of the place changed.
Yeah.
Getting it off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really spun from, again, getting to pour amazing wine at Thelonious, but knowing that like wine and food are meant to be enjoyed together. And of course, like, we served snacks, we served cheese and charcuterie. Sometimes we would dabble a little more than that, but the core was cheese and charcuterie. And everyone would leave when it was time for dinner. And we were like, we want to be able to provide that experience of like a full dinner with wine. Because really, like, that's how I love wine pairings. They're one of my very favorite things about the wine world. And it's so like mind-blowing for people when you can really, I love the process of like figuring them out, but B, when you have a great pairing, you're like, that was awesome. Like it becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And so we always wanted to be able to serve a full dinner here. But then again, when we got Sarah on board, we were like, oh, food's going to be legit. And this was us not knowing our community, not knowing Portland well enough. Our initial concept was that it would be prefix only in the back room. And the front would be like a lounge with like more like a wine bar menu. And so it'd be two totally different experiences. And that lasted for about a month and a half because we quickly realized, like, if we wanted people to come back, they wanted to sit up here, but they didn't want to just have a limited menu. They're like, well, I want the tagliatelle that's on the prefix. And we were like we're selling prefixes out on the weekends, but then during the week it was crickets. And we had like high top long communal tables up here. And then the banquettes in the back. And so we cut down all the high tops and they became these. And we just decided same menu across the board. You can order the prefix if you want. Otherwise it's designed as a la carte. Mm-hmm. And that was a really critical, like if we hadn't made that decision early on, I don't think we would have survived, you know? And same with steps of service. Like we had organized it like a fine dining restaurant would, like kind of with the idea of like captains and back waiters and busters and runners. And we quickly were like, that's not what's going to be sustainable. So pretty early on, we kind of shifted to the model where we have now, where it's designed as an a la carte menu, but we always have an option for a chef's prefix where the chef decides what it is and sends out dishes. And it's like a very cohesive, complete dining experience. And that's our best-selling item. Like people actually love to come in and just be served. But I think they want the option. They don't want to be forced into it. And I've seen restaurants in Portland, and that's, San Francisco and New York, and it's different. But I have yet to see like a thriving prefix menu concept be sustainable long-term here. At least that's open more than 2 days a week. And we realized like we have become like a neighborhood restaurant at our core. Like, of course, especially on the weekends, people come from all parts of town. But like Monday through Thursday are some of our favorite nights. It's our bread and butter of regulars, people in the community, more serious diners. And yeah, so I think, and also the way we staff, like we hire people that really know what they're doing because now we just have servers. We don't have, the manager is the host. Whoever's managing that night is the host. We don't have runners, busters, or bartenders. The servers do everything. They make great money, and it allows a restaurant in this fine dining world with very thin margins to be sustainable. And even that's, it's like margins are very thin for restaurants like this. And we can't overstaff it. It's this very fine, and I'm under no delusions that I'm gonna like retire rich from this restaurant. But I think like for what it is, it pays everyone, pays me a little bit. It makes people happy. It's sort of like, yeah, I love what it is. But we've found this fine balance of like, people have to know what they're doing and hustle, and we all make money and it works. And we are, like, I'm so grateful, knock on wood, to be in a position now after 6 years that we're busy. We're busy. We added a 6th night last year. We're busy 6 nights a week. And like, that is such a blessing in the restaurant world. And it's taken us a long time to get there. But still, like, remember January this year, like the snowstorm. We always close the first 2 weeks of January to give everyone a belated holiday break. And then we ended up being closed for like 3.5 weeks because of that snowstorm. And like, I was worried financially. I was like, we'll bounce back, but this doesn't feel good. So it's like, yeah, it's hard for a restaurant to ever be in a place where you're just like, we're good forever, Yeah.
You talked earlier about all of the pandemic things for yourself personally, kind of the pandemic blessings for yourself personally. Obviously, this had to change. So tell me about getting Arden through the pandemic.
Oh, I feel like I've like trauma blocked most of it. It was just a never-ending ride of like, oh, now we do this, now we do this. Oh, the rules are this. Now we can allow people inside. Now they can be inside but 6 feet apart. Oh, now you can wear a mask, inside but take it off at the table. And so we were just obsessively following the rules because that's what we had to do. So it was like, we actually never closed. Like, shutdown happened. We brought everyone in. We got everyone pizza. I distinctly remember like sitting here being like, hopefully we'll be back in a couple weeks. I had heard about, I was like, I'll try and figure out if unemployment is available. There was a program called WorkShare that still exists that we did the whole pandemic where you can pay, if their work is reduced, they can get partial unemployment. So that was like a whole thing that I was filing every week for everybody. But right away we were like, let's do takeout. And the only time we closed during the entire pandemic was when we all got COVID. And actually, it was in June of 2020. It was before the vaccine. And it was so early on that we were like, do we tell people? Do we freak them out? And I actually did a news interview and admitted that we all had COVID. Because I think we were one of the first restaurants to close because our staff got COVID. And we had so much love and support, and the city brought me groceries. And I'm like, can you imagine now if you're like, oh, I just tested positive for COVID? People are like, God, how soon can you put on a mask and come back to work, But other than that, we were here and operating. And also sometime around June or July, we built an outdoor patio. And and it was not this one, it was a tent that lasted us for 2 years before it was falling apart. But that's a beautiful thing to have come out of the pandemic, that now restaurants have permanent patio seating. So we were like, yeah, this is great. We're going to build a nice one. But it was takeout. It was once in a while we would allow people inside when the restrictions allowed for that. The whole back dining room, I'm already forgetting, the whole back dining room became a storage room. And mainly I was doing this wine club and I would have 50 cases of wine back there a month, which was one of the reasons we had to stop doing the wine club because we literally have no extra storage. But I mean, during Thanksgiving, we did Thanksgiving kits, and I distinctly remember having this massive assembly line where it was everything but the turkey. But we had a brine bag for the turkey, and it was mashed potato or sweet. It was all the things. And for the summer, Eric was like, I want to make sausage. And we sold grill kits, and we sold cocktail kits, and we got our retail license so we could sell wine too. So we did all the things. And then finally, as things started to come back to life, we scaled things back little by little. And actually so we obviously do not do takeout anymore. And we literally don't have the capacity for it. We have the smallest kitchen in Portland. And I just this summer restarted a wine club for Arden. So, and it's kind of a cross between Arden and my Raise a Glass platform. And so, and it's through a third party that handles all the delivery, which is awesome. And so you can sign up and you'll get delivered 2 bottles of wine and then we'll taste them together on Zoom. So that's been fun to restart. But yeah, I think it was to our advantage that we were so new as a restaurant because we weren't so set in our ways. I think the restaurants that struggled a lot were the ones that had done the same thing for 20 years and couldn't fathom doing it any other way. And we were just like, we'll do whatever, I remember we did a wine dinner. It's funny, we did 2 winemaker dinners with Flinner, who are some of our dear friends. And one of them was in August of 2020. And because they had just built this beautiful tasting room in Carlton and it had a big outdoor patio space. So we're like, oh my God, we could do a winemaker dinner on the patio. And it was right before all the fires and it had been hot all summer. And we sold it out instantly. People were so excited to go to an event. And we get there, we get all set up and the skies open and it just downpoured. It was the only rainstorm literally of the month, of the summer. And we were like, what do we do? And people were such troopers. It would never be like this now, but people were just so excited to be out of their houses, covered in rain, just and we were like sneaking people inside, like people were sitting on the stairs, like in someone's office chair. But it was so much fun. And then we did another event with them the next summer where we did like a picnic where we went out to their vineyard to La Belle Promenade, and we served like foie gras jelly sandwiches and like roasted a porchetta, and we had a big tent and we bought picnic blankets for everyone and picnic baskets. So we just did fun stuff like that. And of course it's nice to be back to regularly scheduled programming, but I think it did open the door for like being creative, doing fun events, etc.
So you've talked a little bit about kind of some of your future ambitions and goals already. So, but I'm curious about, as you look at Race of Glass, as you look at Arden, what have you not done that you want to do outside of what you already talked about? Is there more growth here, or are there projects you haven't tried, or is it in a place where you're just kind of letting it be?
You know, I think, what's the old adage? Like, if you're not growing, you're dying. Like, I think my role at Arden now, as I see it, is to be able to get my head out of just the day-to-day of service, because that really does suck up all your energy. And I'm trying to get Eric to that place as well. You know, like, I think both of us we know service. We've done service for so many years that it's very easy to start the week with like, oh, I want to work on this bigger picture thing, but then you get sucked into service. And I would love to keep building Arden on like a national scale. Like, I want people in New York, when they're going to visit Portland, to their 3 friends to be like, oh, you have to go to Arden, you know? And so doing dinners like, you know, like this event with John Bonet next week, I'm super excited about. Looking for more opportunities. And of course, we still collaborate as much as possible with local winemakers. But, you know, the dinner on Monday with Clemence Lalarge, like, this is the first year that our winemaker dinner series involves international winemakers. And that's been really exciting. That was a goal of mine. We're about to do a swap with Scribe Winery in Sonoma. So they're launching in the Portland market, and they're gonna do like kind of a Nouveau dinner, because they have a Nouveau style wine. And then we're actually gonna fly down there and do like a takeover at their winery. So I would love to do more stuff like that, whether it's, you know, taking some of the team to New York or to San Francisco and doing like takeovers or residencies, like hosting chefs, I would love to see more of that. So yeah, it's like keeping service going on a day-to-day basis, but just figuring out like what else can we do, what other collaborations can we do.
So you talked earlier about kind of your initial impressions of Oregon wine, being surprised by Oregon wine becoming a thing while you were out of town. Tell me about, as you came back to Portland and started to meet the wine industry, what were your impressions of Oregon wine and the people making it, and what changes have you seen since? Yeah,
I mean, so again, I grew up right in the heart. It's now the Tualatin, it's now the Laurelwood AVA, but it was always Chehalem Mountains when I was growing up. And you know, I was aware of some vineyards, but I remember my parents live still about 5 minutes from the Allison. Like, if you're driving from the Allison to Ponzi, they're like on that street halfway between. And when they started construction for that, I was in high school, and we all thought we were like, what are you smoking? You're putting like a state-of-the-art resort in Newburgh? Like, are you insane? And clearly they showed us all wrong. But I guess, like, you know, so I was gone while a lot of the stuff was happening. And when I was learning wine in California, all of my experience, like, I was going to visit a lot of wineries in Sonoma and Napa that have been established for a very long time. And so, like, yes, we were visiting eclectic winemakers like Sean Thackeray, but, you know, I also got to go to Dominus and William Sellium and Arajo, and like big places where you're walking into these very grand things, and they're like, here's our history. And when I got up to Oregon, I think my biggest impression was like how like endearingly, I don't know, like open-hearted and collaborative, and like, yes, of course there were places with nice tasting rooms, but so many of the winemakers we were interested in seeing were A, kind of new to the scene, or B, like classics like Belpont or Beaufrere or Cameron or Brickhouse, they were still very humble. You know, it was like, yes, they had their winery, but they weren't trying to show off. And that was my biggest kind of impression of like California versus Oregon. Like, these people are so good at what they do, and they've been doing it for 30 years, but they're very humble. And, you know, we're still tasting in their garage, you know? And I really loved that. And then it was interesting to see, like, so Alex, my ex, he wanted to make wine. And so that was like a whole other, I was never very involved in the winemaking process, but I like figured out how to get a winery license and all that. But he was making wine at the Carlton Winemaker Studio. And so we spent a lot of time there, and that was such a hub of like creativity. And Anthony was such a great, you know, there were people there like Anthony that had been around for a long time that were sort of and Andrew Rich were kind of mentors to then all these like young guns who were like figuring out what they were doing. And that was, you know, I think Division had just started. You know, day camp didn't exist. There weren't a lot, but that wasn't, I didn't never seen that in California. And I was really struck by the collaborative and creative environment that Portland had. Like, you know, Chad Stock was doing Minimus at the time, and I had never seen wine like that before. And he was just like, oh, let's put Brettanomyces in it, or like, let's do Syrah and Acacia Barrel. And, you know, he was kind of doing what we had done at Thelonious, where he was like a one-man show, and he was like, I'm doing whatever I want, and it's fun. And so I loved that spirit. And it was cool to see, like, getting familiar with, like, what the bar had been set in Oregon, like Beaufrere, like Brick House, like Cameron, like Bergstrom. But then, you know, all these kind of up-and-coming natural winemakers. And I will say that, like, a lot of the natural wine that was happening a decade ago, I'm impressed with. You've watched those winemakers figure out what they're doing, you know? I mean, I'm all for the natural wine movement in that it's bringing in young people, it's bringing in fresh blood to wine, but do I want to drink a whole bottle of, like, pretty funky wine? No. So I appreciate when, like, a natural wine, someone who's really making truly non-intervention wine, gets good at what they do. And the wines are clean and interesting, and you're seeing that more and more in Oregon now, which I think is exciting, and I think is raising the bar for, like, someone who is starting out. If they are making wine that is not palatable, it's not going to sell. You know, whereas I think 10 years ago, people were just excited for new wine, and now the bar's like raised a little bit.
So where does the industry go from here?
You know, it's funny, like this dinner that I'm doing with John week after next, I think I have always been curious. Of course, I've been excited about Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. I'm personally like a little more excited about Chardonnay than Pinot. I think Chardonnay is what Oregon does best. Controversial opinion, maybe. Maybe I'm just Pinot'd out a little bit. But I get really excited about all of the experimentation happening with other grape varietals. And the premise of the dinner we're doing is, you know, when you learn about the Willamette Valley in any wine context, it's like, oh, it's the New World rendition of Burgundy. You know, like Burgundy, Willamette Valley, they're these two peas in a pod. And like from day one, people have kind of said that. And now that we're learning, now that there has been 40 years to kind of 60 years, I guess now, to experiment, plant other grapes, plant other parts of the valley, really dig into soil types. I think it's an interesting question to ask, like, is Burgundy the best comparison to make? Kate over at Division, she put the idea in a lot of our heads that the Auvergne is actually a much better comparison because on a soil level, Burgundy has very different soils than the Willamette Valley. It has basic soils. You know, they're all like calcareous and limestone, and that actually promotes naturally higher acidity in the wines. And the Willamette Valley is opposite. Like, we have volcanic soils, which are acidic, which promote lower acidity in the wines. And so, like, there are some inherent fundamental differences. But, like, at this dinner, I think it's going to be fun to, like, kind of go region by region in France and be like, oh, like, is the Loire Valley a good touch point? Should more people be planting Chenin Blanc? Should we see more Gamay? Like, for me, I think Beaujolais and the Auvergne are going to be cool touch points. I would love to see more Gamay here. I think as the weather gets a little warmer, the couple Syrahs that I've had from the valley for the sites that can ripen them are really exciting. I think we're going to keep doing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay really well, but I also think it's getting harder to sell those wines. And I think if everyone just comes in and continues to plant those 2 grapes, it's going to, be harder to sell, diminish the value. Like, I would love to see people do a little more experimentation. And, like, I've had some really great Albareños. A couple of people are planting Albarino, which I love. Aligote is a no-brainer. So I'm like, and then you go to the Gorge, and like, I love what Analema's doing, where they're like, this is so similar to Ribera Sacra. So they have Mencia and Tempranillo and Godeo and Albarino, and the wines are amazing. I would love to see more Trousseau in the valley, maybe some Savagnin. Like, I love that kind of thing. Yeah. And I think where my and other restaurant people's role is to like foster excitement for that diversity amongst consumers, because I think people just think that we do Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and especially we'll get tourists, and I get excited when tourists are open to trying, especially if they're drinking 2 bottles of wine. I'm like, get a Pinot and then let's crack open John Paul's Nebbiolo, like, let's try something else too. Yeah.
You talked earlier about the sort of the online wine education the Raise a Glass is working on. Obviously, you mentioned part of that was sort of breaking down the barrier of entry for people. Tell me about getting consumers who are maybe intimidated or maybe younger, maybe whatever. What's the biggest thing to get them excited, and what are you trying to put forward that breaks those barriers down?
I think I really try to approach it as that wine is a way to connect with people, to connect with each other. Wine should be fun. It should be a way to like enhance a social experience. It can be a way to share stories. It can be, if you're going to hang out with your friend, like having a bottle of wine, you're probably going to have a drink of some sort, I guess, unless you're a very more responsible human than I am. And wine is a way to like, I think for young people, I think wine feels adult in a certain way. Feels like you're not just going to go like get drunk and have a hangover tomorrow. Like, it's a very social thing, and you can sip it. And for people who enjoy food, it really like enhances that experience. But I think the core of what I try to get at is like immediately making people feel at ease and comfortable, and like really defining any complicated word I'm throwing out there, defining terminology. One of the first things I actually like to do with people is teach them how to blind taste, because people are always shocked at how it builds confidence. They can identify all these different qualities in a wine without knowing anything about wine. They can look at the color. They can kind of describe what the legs are doing. Maybe they can't necessarily like identify all the complex smells, but maybe they can think like, is it tropical? Is it citrus? Is it, melon? Is it red fruit or black fruit? Like, they can do that. Anyone can do that. And then they can identify like acidity and tannin. They can identify alcohol. And based on all those things as we go, I'm like, oh, so if the wine smells like an apple, does it smell like a baked apple or like a tart, just barely ripe Granny Smith apple? Like, I don't know, maybe more like a Granny Smith. I'm like, okay, so that means like this fruit came from a place where it wasn't very ripe. What kind of a climate gives you fruit that isn't very ripe? And they're like, I don't know, cold climate? I'm like, yeah. And then we taste it, and I'm like, how much is your mouth salivating? They're like, a lot. I'm like, and so what would that mean about the fruit? Is it really ripe or is it not? And so by the end of that process, you can see people like feel really confident. And then it's like, of course, then you can go back and like start learning regions and start learning varietals. But I kind of like to start there. And in my course, like the first module is literally just what is wine? Like, what is wine and what is it not? Mm-hmm. Can you make wine from other fruit? What's the difference between wine and whiskey? Like, what is fermentation? Like, on a very simple level. And then, like, we go over some core grape varietals and what they taste like. and then we talk about blind tasting, and then we deep dive into like regions and stuff. But I think approaching it from like giving people confidence and showing them that it can be fun and like they can laugh over it. And then they get excited. Then once they're hooked, then it's like, well, let's learn about this region. And then they want to go try the wine from that region or try food from that region.
Last question for you. What are you proudest of so far? What's your biggest achievement so far?
I think Arden, like where Arden is now. Like I am not someone who ever intended to own my own business, certainly not to run a staff of people, to manage people. It still does not come easily to me. And I think just having a restaurant that has like A, survived, but B, one where I think the culture at Arden is like what I feel most proud of, because I think it's a really nice place to work. And it's like, of course, sometimes there's little drama things, but it's like overall, I've worked in so many restaurants where it's anxiety inducing, where the front of house doesn't meld with the back of house, where people yell, where people cry, and Arden is not that. And Eric and the whole kitchen team, like it's one bit, I don't think of it as like front of house and back of house, and I hope other people don't too. You know, it's a very like, we can't because it's like literally open. There is no divider. And the fact that like, I think the fact that like people, I always get really touched when people come in and are like celebrating. I just had some industry people, they eloped and like this was their place they wanted to come celebrate. And that like feels really special. And I know it's not just something I did. Like it's really been a team effort, and I'm really proud of like when it is my call to bring people on, like bringing the right people on, and that like this is a place people want to return to and like tell their friends about. And it sounds simple, but I think it's like I try not to take that for granted. It's like a lot of things that go into it, and it's easy to lose sight of that when stuff like this happens. Yesterday when we have to close for service because the hood goes off, or someone tests positive for COVID, or whatever it is, there's always hangups, and it's very easy to get stuck in the negativity of one event as opposed to being like, we're doing fine, we're doing more than fine, and like this is just another challenge. And at this point I just have to look at it as like par for the course. There's always going to be a little adventure. You have to frame it as an adventure, because if you frame it as like a catastrophe, then I'm unhappy and then everyone else is unhappy. And so yeah, it's been a lesson for me in like my own state management. Yeah.
All right. All the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sharing your time, sharing your beautiful space with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I'll
my
let you off the hook.
pleasure. Thank you for having me.